Christmas Eve, 1852. The air across Thornhill Plantation hung cold and sharp, biting at exposed skin like invisible needles. Snow had begun to fall just after noon, soft and silent, blanketing the red clay roads and the bare branches of the hickory trees that lined the long approach to the main house. By evening, the world had turned white and muffled, as if God himself had drawn a heavy curtain over the land to hide what men did in the dark. Inside the great house, the Caldwell family prepared for their annual Christmas service. Candles flickered in every window, their golden light spilling out onto the snow-covered veranda. The scent of roasted pork, sweet potatoes glazed with molasses, and apple cider mulled with cinnamon drifted through the halls. Mrs. Abigail Caldwell, a woman of 43, with graying auburn hair pinned tight beneath a lace cap, moved through the parlor with the practiced grace of someone who had never questioned her place in the world. Her husband, Thaddeus Caldwell, sat in his high-backed chair near the fire, his boots polished to a mirror shine, his hands folded over the leather-bound Bible resting in his lap. Their son, William, 22 and fresh from 2 years at the University of Virginia, stood near the window, watching the snow fall. He wore a dark wool suit tailored in Richmond, and his hair was slicked back with pomade that smelled faintly of lavender and lemon. He did not look at the fields beyond the house. He did not think of the 47 men, women, and children who lived in the cramped cabins behind the smokehouse, their walls thin as paper, their fires small and struggling against the cold. Before we begin this journey into one of the South's darkest and most unspeakable stories, I need to ask you something. Where are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments. And if this is your first time on our channel, subscribe now, because what you're about to hear is a story that official history tried to bury, but memory refused to forget. At precisely 6 o'clock, the enslaved men and women of Thornhill were summoned to the great house. They came in silence, their breath visible in the frigid air, their bodies wrapped in whatever scraps of cloth they had managed to patch together. They gathered in the wide hallway that connected the front parlor to the dining room, standing shoulder to shoulder, heads bowed, hands folded. The children clung to their mothers' skirts, their eyes wide and watchful. Thaddeus Caldwell rose from his chair and stepped into the center of the room. He opened the Bible and began to read from the Gospel of Luke, his voice deep and resonant, rolling through the house like thunder. He spoke of shepherds and angels, of a child born in a manger, of peace on earth and goodwill toward men. His wife stood beside him, her hands clasped at her waist, her expression serene. William leaned against the doorframe, his arms crossed, his eyes half closed as though the whole affair bored him. And then, in the middle of the reading, something happened. Marcus, a man of 31 with broad shoulders and calloused hands, stood near the back of the gathered crowd. His skin was the color of polished walnut, his hair cropped close to his skull, his jaw strong and angular. He had worked the cotton fields since he was 8 years old, had lost his mother to fever when he was 12, had watched his younger sister sold away to a trader from Georgia when he was 17. He had learned to move through the world with his eyes down, his voice soft, his body compliant. He had learned to swallow rage the way other men swallowed food. But tonight, as Thaddeus Caldwell read about angels singing praises to God, Marcus felt something shift inside him. Perhaps it was exhaustion. Perhaps it was the absurdity of standing in a cold hallway, listening to a man who owned him speak about divine love. Perhaps it was the memory of his sister's face as she was dragged away, screaming. Whatever it was, it loosened something in his chest, and before he could stop himself, the corners of his mouth lifted, just slightly, just enough. It was not a smile of joy. It was not defiance. It was the involuntary twitch of a man who had finally reached the edge of what he could endure without breaking. But Thaddeus Caldwell saw it. He stopped mid-sentence, his eyes locking onto Marcus. The room fell into a silence so thick it felt like drowning. Mrs. Caldwell's hands tightened at her waist. William straightened, his boredom replaced by curiosity. Thaddeus closed the Bible slowly. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "You," he said, his gaze fixed on Marcus, "you find something amusing in the Word of God?" Marcus's smile vanished. His heart slammed against his ribs. He shook his head, his voice barely audible. "No, sir. No, sir, I don't." "Then why?" Thaddeus said, his tone cold and measured. "Were you grinning like a fool while I read scripture?" Marcus opened his mouth, but no words came. There was no answer that would save him. There never was. Thaddeus turned to his son. "William, take him to the barn." William Caldwell did not hesitate. He stepped forward, his polished boots clicking against the hardwood floor, and gestured toward the door with a flick of his wrist. Two other men, overseers who lived in a small house near the edge of the property, moved from their positions along the wall and flanked Marcus on either side. Their names were Hosea Trent and Rufus Gann, both white men in their 30s, both lean and hard-eyed, both accustomed to the work of breaking bodies and spirits. Marcus did not resist. Resistance was suicide. He walked between them, his head down, his hands trembling at his sides. The other enslaved people in the hallway parted to let them pass, their faces blank, their eyes averted. They had learned long ago not to watch. Watching made you complicit. Watching made you next. The door opened, and the cold air rushed in, sharp and biting. The snow was falling harder now, thick flakes swirling in the wind, clinging to Marcus's hair and shoulders as he stepped off the veranda and into the night. The barn stood about 200 yards from the main house, a dark shape rising against the white landscape, its wooden walls weathered grey, its roof sagging in the middle. The smell of hay and manure and old leather drifted out through the cracks. William walked behind Marcus, his hands in his pockets, his breath pluming in the cold. He did not speak. He did not need to. The silence was its own kind of violence. Inside the barn the air was warmer but still damp, thick with the smell of animals and earth. A single lantern hung from a beam near the center of the space, its light flickering and casting long shadows across the walls. Hosea moved to the corner and picked up a length of rope. Rufus grabbed Marcus by the arm and shoved him toward a wooden post that stood in the middle of the barn, a post that had been used for this purpose before. The wood was stained dark in places, the stains old and permanent. Marcus's wrists were bound to the post, his arms stretched above his head, his body forced upright. His breath came fast and shallow, his chest rising and falling in quick, panicked bursts. He did not beg. Begging only made it worse. William stepped into the light, his face calm, almost thoughtful. He removed his coat and draped it over a nearby stall door. He rolled up his sleeves slowly, methodically, as though preparing for any ordinary task. Then he turned to Hosea. "Get the pliers," he said. Hosea nodded and disappeared into the shadows. When he returned, he held a pair of rusted iron pliers, the kind used for pulling nails from horseshoes, for bending wire, for gripping things that needed to be torn free. He handed them to William without a word. William tested the grip, opening and closing the pliers a few times, the metal scraping against itself with a sound like grinding teeth. He stepped closer to Marcus, so close that Marcus could smell the pomade in his hair, the faint sweetness of the cider on his breath. "You grinned," William said quietly, almost conversationally, "in front of my father, in front of my mother, in front of God himself." Marcus said nothing. There was nothing to say. William reached up and grabbed Marcus's jaw. Forcing his mouth open, Marcus tried to pull away, but the ropes held him fast. His eyes went wide, his breath hitching in his throat. "Open," William said, his voice soft but unyielding. Marcus's lips parted. His teeth were white and straight, strong from years of chewing cornmeal and raw vegetables, from grinding down the little food he was given. They were one of the few things about his body that still felt whole. William positioned the pliers around the front tooth on the left side of Marcus's mouth. He did not hesitate. He clamped down and pulled. The pain was immediate and total, a white-hot explosion that obliterated thought, obliterated breath, obliterated everything except the sensation of bone tearing free from gum, of nerves ripping, of blood flooding his mouth. Marcus's scream tore through the barn, raw and animalistic, but the sound was swallowed by the snow outside, muffled by the thick walls, lost in the night. William dropped the tooth onto the dirt floor. It landed with a soft clink, a small white fragment against the dark earth. He repositioned the pliers and pulled again. By the time William Caldwell finished, Marcus had lost 4 teeth from the front of his mouth, 2 from the top, 2 from the bottom. The pliers had torn through gum and root, leaving jagged wounds that bled freely, the blood pooling in his mouth and spilling down his chin, dripping onto his chest and soaking into the coarse fabric of his shirt. His jaw throbbed with a pain so deep it felt like his entire skull was splitting open. His throat was raw from screaming, though the screams had eventually died down to low, guttural moans, sounds that no longer seemed human. William wiped the pliers on a rag and handed them back to Hosea. He rolled down his sleeves, retrieved his coat, and walked toward the barn door without looking back. His breath was steady, his expression unchanged. He might have been leaving a business meeting. "Leave him there until morning," he said to Hosea and Rufus. "Let him think about what happens when you disrespect this family." The 2 overseers nodded. They extinguished the lantern and followed William out into the snow, closing the barn door behind them. The latch clicked into place, a small, final sound that echoed in the darkness. Marcus hung from the post, his wrists raw and bleeding where the ropes had bitten into his skin, his head sagging forward, his mouth open and leaking blood. The cold crept in through the cracks in the walls, wrapping around him like a living thing, sinking into his bones. His body shook violently, not just from the cold, but from shock, from the trauma of what had been done to him. His mind drifted in and out of consciousness, fragments of thought rising and falling like waves. He thought of his mother, dead 15 years now, her face a blur in his memory. He thought of his sister, whose name he had not spoken aloud in over a decade, because speaking it felt like reopening a wound that would never heal. He thought of the other men and women in the cabins, the ones who would hear what had happened to him and would lower their eyes and say nothing, because there was nothing to say, nothing to do. He thought of God, the God that Thaddeus Caldwell read about, the God who watched over shepherds and sent angels to sing. He wondered if that God could see him now, hanging in the dark, bleeding into the dirt. He wondered if that God cared. The hours passed slowly. Outside, the snow continued to fall, building up against the barn door, covering the fields and the cabins, and the road that led away from Thornhill Plantation. Inside the great house, the Caldwell family finished their Christmas meal and retired to their rooms. Mrs. Caldwell said a prayer before bed, thanking God for his blessings and asking for continued prosperity in the year to come. William sat by his window for a time, watching the snow, thinking about nothing in particular. Thaddeus read from his Bible before blowing out the candle on his nightstand and pulling the heavy quilts up to his chin. None of them thought about Marcus. By dawn, the bleeding had slowed but not stopped. Marcus's mouth was a ruin of torn flesh and exposed nerve. The gaps where his teeth had been dark and swollen. His lips were cracked and crusted with dried blood. His tongue felt thick and useless, a foreign object in his own mouth. When Hosea and Rufus returned to the barn in the pale grey light of Christmas morning, they found him still hanging from the post, barely conscious, his eyes half closed, his breathing shallow. Hosea cut the ropes. Marcus collapsed onto the dirt floor, his legs too weak to hold him. Rufus kicked him lightly in the ribs. "Get up," he said. "You got work to do." Marcus did not move, could not move. His body felt like it had been hollowed out, like there was nothing left inside him but pain and emptiness. Rufus kicked him again, harder this time. "I said get up." Marcus pushed himself onto his hands and knees, his arms shaking, his vision swimming. Blood dripped from his mouth onto the ground beneath him. He stayed there for a long moment, breathing hard, willing his body to obey. Then, slowly, he stood. His legs trembled, his head swam, but he stood. Hosea pointed toward the door. "Back to the cabins. You got until noon to rest, then you're in the fields." Marcus stumbled toward the door, his hand braced against the wall for support. He stepped out into the cold morning air, the snow crunching beneath his feet, the sky a pale, colorless expanse above him. The cabins were visible in the distance, thin trails of smoke rising from their chimneys. He walked toward them, each step an act of will, each breath a battle. When he reached his cabin, he pushed open the door and collapsed onto the narrow cot in the corner. The other men who shared the space, 3 of them, all field workers, looked at him but said nothing. They had heard the screams. They knew what had happened. There was nothing to say. Marcus lay there, staring at the ceiling, his mouth filled with the taste of blood and iron. He did not sleep. He did not cry. He simply existed, his body broken, his mind somewhere far away, floating in a space beyond pain, beyond thought, beyond hope. But he was alive, and that somehow was the most terrifying thing of all. The days after Christmas passed in a grey, frozen blur. The snow melted slowly, leaving the fields muddy and treacherous, the roads slick with half-frozen slush. The work at Thornhill Plantation continued as it always did. Cotton bales loaded onto wagons, fences mended, livestock tended, the endless rhythm of labor that defined every waking hour for the men and women held in bondage there. The world turned, indifferent to suffering, indifferent to loss. Marcus returned to the fields on the afternoon of December 26th. His mouth was still swollen, the wounds where his teeth had been torn out, oozing blood and pus. He could not chew solid food. He subsisted on cornmeal mush, thinned with water, sipping it slowly, each swallow an agony that radiated through his jaw and up into his skull. His speech was slurred and strange, his tongue unable to form words properly without the support of his front teeth. He spoke as little as possible. Silence became his armor. The other enslaved people at Thornhill watched him with a mixture of pity and fear. They saw the dark gaps in his mouth when he opened it to drink, saw the way he moved more slowly now, as though each step required a calculation, a negotiation with his own body. They saw the way his eyes had changed, something behind them had dimmed, or perhaps hardened, like water freezing into ice. No one spoke of what had happened. To speak of it was to invite the same fate. But they all knew. Knowledge passed through the cabins like smoke, invisible but pervasive, settling into every corner, every breath. In the great house, life continued as it always had. Mrs. Caldwell supervised the household staff with her usual efficiency, directing the cleaning of silver, the washing of linens, the preparation of meals. Thaddeus spent his mornings in his study, reviewing ledgers and correspondence, writing letters to other plantation owners about crop yields and market prices. William rode into town twice a week to visit friends, to attend dinners, to court the daughter of a tobacco merchant whose father owned land in 3 counties. None of them mentioned Marcus. He had become, in their minds, a problem that had been solved, a lesson that had been taught. The matter was closed, but something had changed, though they did not yet recognize it. It began in small ways. Thaddeus found himself waking in the middle of the night, his heart pounding for no reason he could name. He would sit up in bed, listening to the silence of the house, feeling as though someone were standing just outside his door, waiting. But when he rose and checked, there was no one there, only darkness and the faint creak of old wood settling. Mrs. Caldwell developed a persistent unease that she could not articulate. She would be arranging flowers in the parlor or reviewing the week's menu with the cook, and she would feel it, a prickling at the back of her neck, a sense of being watched. She would turn quickly, but there was never anyone there, just the empty hallway, the quiet house, the ordinary objects of her life. William noticed it too, though he dismissed it as fatigue or the effects of too much whiskey. He would be sitting in the parlor after dinner, reading a newspaper, and he would glance up to find the room feeling wrong somehow, as though the shadows in the corners had grown deeper, as though the air had thickened. He would shake his head, pour himself another drink, and tell himself he was imagining things, but the feeling persisted, and in the fields, Marcus worked. His body moved through the motions, bending, lifting, hauling, planting. His hands blistered and bled. His back ached. His mouth throbbed with a dull, constant pain that never fully receded. But he did not complain. He did not slow. He did not falter. He simply endured. And in his endurance, something took root. Not hope. Hope was a luxury he could not afford. Not rage. Rage would consume him, leave him hollow. It was something else, something quieter and more patient. It was the understanding that survival in its purest form was a form of resistance. That to continue existing in the face of cruelty, to refuse to be erased, was its own kind of defiance. He did not think these thoughts consciously. They lived deeper than thought, in the marrow of his bones, in the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. They were the truth his body carried, even when his mind could not. The other enslaved people began to notice something different about Marcus. He did not speak more than before. In fact, he spoke even less. But when he moved through the rows of cotton or sat outside his cabin in the evenings, there was a stillness to him that felt almost deliberate, almost intentional. It was as though he had become a fixed point in the world, unmovable, unyielding. And the Caldwell family, though they did not speak of it, began to feel his presence in a way they had not before. They could not have explained it. They would not have admitted it. But when Marcus passed near the great house on his way to the barn, when he stood in the fields visible from the upstairs windows, when he crossed the yard in the early morning light, they noticed him, they felt him, and something in that noticing made them uncomfortable in a way they could not name. It was not fear, not yet, but it was the beginning of something that would grow, slow and inexorable, like roots pushing through stone. January arrived cold and unforgiving. The fields of Thornhill Plantation lay dormant beneath a thin crust of frost that sparkled in the weak morning light. The trees stood bare and skeletal, their branches black against the pale sky. Inside the cabins, the enslaved people huddled close to their small fires, their breath visible even indoors, their bodies wrapped in threadbare blankets and scraps of cloth that did little to keep out the cold. Marcus had stopped trying to sleep through the night. The pain in his mouth had settled into a permanent ache, a low thrumming presence that never quite left him. His gums had begun to heal, the torn tissue slowly knitting itself back together. But the absence of his teeth left his mouth feeling strange and hollow, his speech still slurred and imprecise. He drank his thin meals of cornmeal and water, sometimes flavored with a bit of salt pork fat if the kitchen had scraps to spare. He did not complain. Complaining changed nothing. At night, when the others in his cabin had fallen into restless sleep, Marcus sat on the edge of his cot and stared at the wall. His mind did not wander. He did not think about the past or imagine the future. He existed in a space of pure present, a kind of emptiness that felt both protective and suffocating. He had learned to live inside that emptiness, to make it his refuge. But in the great house, the Caldwells could not find such refuge. Thaddeus had taken to drinking brandy before bed, a habit he had never indulged in before. He told himself it helped him sleep, that it calmed his nerves after long days of managing the plantation. But the truth, which he did not acknowledge even to himself, was that he needed the brandy to quiet the unease that crept over him each evening as the sun set and the house grew dark. He found himself checking the locks on the doors, peering out windows, listening for sounds that never came. He felt foolish doing it, but he could not stop. Mrs. Caldwell had begun to avoid certain parts of the house. The hallway where the Christmas service had been held felt wrong to her now, though she could not have said why. She found excuses to take different routes through the house, to send servants to retrieve items she might otherwise have fetched herself. At night, she lay awake beside her husband, listening to him snore, feeling the darkness press in around her like a physical weight. She prayed more frequently, her prayers taking on a desperate, pleading quality that she tried to disguise even from herself. William had returned to university in mid-January, and his absence brought a kind of relief to the house, though no one spoke of it. He had seemed distracted in the weeks following Christmas, prone to sudden silences and long stares out the window. His mother had asked him once if he was feeling well, and he had snapped at her in a way he never had before, then immediately apologized and retreated to his room. When he left for Virginia, Thaddeus clapped him on the shoulder and told him to study hard. Neither of them mentioned Marcus. Neither of them needed to. In the fields, the work shifted with the season. There was no cotton to pick, but there were ditches to clear, fences to repair, tools to mend, wood to chop. The cold made every task harder, the frozen ground unyielding, the icy wind cutting through even the thickest layers of cloth. Marcus worked alongside the other men, his movements steady and methodical. He did not socialize. He did not joke or sing the way some of the others did to pass the time. He simply worked. But the other men noticed something. Marcus never looked at the ground anymore. Before, like all of them, he had kept his eyes down, a survival instinct so ingrained it was almost unconscious. But now, Marcus looked straight ahead. When the overseers passed, he did not avert his gaze. When Thaddeus Caldwell rode out to inspect the fields, Marcus did not bow his head. He did not stare. That would have been suicide. But he did not look away either. His eyes were level, steady, unreadable. Hosea Trent noticed it first. He was walking through the rows one afternoon, checking the progress on a ditch that needed to be dug before the spring rains came, when he saw Marcus standing at the far end, leaning on his shovel, his eyes fixed on the horizon. There was nothing defiant in his posture, nothing aggressive, but there was something about the way he stood, the way he held himself, that made Hosea pause. He walked over, his boots crunching on the frozen earth. "You got a problem?" Hosea asked, his voice sharp. Marcus turned his head slowly. His face was impassive, his eyes dark and unreadable. He shook his head. "No, sir," he said, the words thick and strange without his front teeth. Hosea stared at him for a long moment, searching for something. Insolence, defiance, challenge, but there was nothing there. Just a man standing in a field, holding a shovel. Hosea spat into the dirt and walked away, but the encounter left him unsettled in a way he could not name. That evening back at the cabin, one of the younger men, a boy named Elijah, maybe 17, asked Marcus a question. It was the first time anyone had directly addressed him since Christmas. "How you still standin'?" Elijah asked, his voice quiet, almost reverent. "After what they done to you, how you still here?" Marcus did not answer right away. He sat on his cot, his hands resting on his knees, his gaze fixed on the small fire in the center of the cabin. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and rough, each word shaped carefully around the gaps in his mouth. "Ain't got a choice," he said. "Standing or laying down don't matter. Long as I'm breathing, I'm here." Elijah nodded slowly, though he did not fully understand. None of them did, but they felt it, the weight of Marcus's presence, the quiet, unyielding fact of his survival. It was not inspiring. It was not hopeful. It was simply undeniable. And in the great house, as Thaddeus Caldwell poured himself another glass of brandy and Mrs. Caldwell pulled her blankets tighter around her shoulders, that undeniable fact began to press against them like water against a dam, slow and patient and relentless. February brought no warmth, only a different kind of cold, wet and seeping, the kind that soaked through clothing and settled into bones. The skies hung low and grey, threatening rain that never quite came, leaving the air heavy and oppressive. At Thornhill Plantation, the rhythm of work continued, but beneath the surface, something was shifting, something none of the Caldwells could quite articulate, but all of them felt. Thaddeus had become irritable, snapping at his wife over trivial matters, a meal served too late, a shirt not pressed to his satisfaction. He spent more time in his study, poring over ledgers that he had already reviewed a dozen times, finding errors that did not exist, questioning expenses that had been perfectly reasonable. At night, he lay awake, staring at the ceiling, his mind circling endlessly around nothing in particular. He felt as though he were waiting for something, though he did not know what. Mrs. Caldwell had taken to spending her afternoons in the parlor, embroidering pillow covers that she did not need, rearranging furniture that had been perfectly arranged. finding endless small tasks to occupy her hands and her mind. She avoided the windows that faced the fields. She did not want to see the men working out there, did not want to catch sight of any particular figure moving through the rows. She told herself she was simply tired, that the winter was wearing on her, that spring would bring relief. But she knew, in some unacknowledged corner of her mind, that this was not about the weather. The servants in the house, 3 women who cooked and cleaned, an older man who tended the fires and handled heavy lifting, moved through their tasks with quiet efficiency. They noticed the tension in the air, the way Mrs. Caldwell's hands trembled slightly when she poured tea, the way Mr. Caldwell's jaw clenched when he read his correspondence. They did not speak of it among themselves, but they understood. The house had changed. Something had entered it, something invisible and patient, and it was waiting. In the fields, Marcus continued to work. His body had grown thinner over the winter, the meager rations insufficient to sustain the labor demanded of him. His ribs showed through his shirt, his cheekbones sharp beneath the skin. But he did not weaken. If anything, he seemed to grow more solid, more present, as though he were condensing into something harder, more essential. The other men had stopped trying to talk to him. He responded when spoken to, answered questions when asked, but he offered nothing beyond what was required. His silence was not sullen or resentful, it was simply complete. He had withdrawn into himself so thoroughly that he seemed almost unreachable, a man who existed behind a wall of his own making. But that wall was not invisible. The others could feel it, and more importantly, the Caldwells could feel it. It happened in small moments, barely noticeable at first. Thaddeus would be riding past the fields, and he would see Marcus standing at the edge of a row, and their eyes would meet for the briefest instant. There was nothing in Marcus's gaze, no hatred, no pleading, no emotion at all, just a steady, unflinching acknowledgement of Thaddeus's presence. And yet, every time it happened, Thaddeus felt a cold flutter in his chest, a sensation like missing a step on a staircase. Mrs. Caldwell experienced it too, though she tried to avoid the occasions that might lead to it. One morning, she happened to glance out the kitchen window while speaking to the cook about the evening meal, and she saw Marcus crossing the yard, carrying a bundle of firewood. He did not look toward the house. He did not slow or pause. But she felt for just a moment as though the air had thickened, as though the space between them had collapsed into something unbearably small. She turned away quickly, her hand pressed to her chest, her breath coming short and fast. "Ma'am?" the cook asked, concerned. "You feelin' all right?" Mrs. Caldwell nodded, forcing a smile. Yes, just a chill. The weather, you know." But it was not the weather. By mid-February, Thaddeus had begun to notice something else. The other enslaved people at Thornhill seemed different around Marcus. They did not defer to him. He held no authority, had no special status, but they moved around him with a kind of careful respect, a subtle shift in their behavior that was almost imperceptible but undeniably present. When Marcus entered the cabin at night, the conversations that had been happening fell quiet. When he stood in line for the meager evening rations, the others stepped aside without being asked. It was not fear. It was something else, something Thaddeus could not name. One evening, he mentioned it to Rufus Gann, who had come to the house to report on the day's work in the fields. "That one," Thaddeus said, gesturing vaguely toward the window. "The one from Christmas. Marcus, you notice anything strange about him?" Rufus shifted his weight, uncomfortable. "Strange how, sir?" "I don't know," Thaddeus said, irritation creeping into his voice. "Just different, the way he carries himself. The way the others act around him." Rufus considered this. "He don't cause no trouble, sir. Works hard, don't talk much. Ain't seen nothing I'd call a problem." Thaddeus nodded slowly, though the answer did not satisfy him. "Keep an eye on him." "Yes, sir." But keeping an eye on Marcus did not ease Thaddeus's unease. If anything, it deepened it, because the more he watched, the more he saw that Marcus was doing nothing at all. He was simply existing, and somehow that existence had become unbearable, Late one night, unable to sleep, Thaddeus rose from bed and walked through the house. He moved through the darkened hallways, his bare feet silent on the wooden floors, his nightshirt loose around his body. He went to the front parlor and stood at the window looking out at the fields. The moon was nearly full, its pale light casting long shadows across the snow-dusted ground. He could see the cabins in the distance, smoke rising from their chimneys, thin and insubstantial, and he thought of Marcus, lying in one of those cabins, his mouth ruined, his body broken, his spirit, what? Defeated? Crushed? No, that was the problem. Marcus's spirit was not crushed. It was there, intact, undeniable. And that fact, more than anything, terrified Thaddeus Caldwell in ways he could not begin to understand. March came with unpredictable weather, days of sudden warmth followed by nights of bitter cold, the ground thawing and refreezing, the roads turning to rivers of mud. At Thornhill Plantation, the work shifted toward preparation for planting season. The fields needed to be turned, the soil tested, seeds sorted and stored. The pace quickened, the days growing longer, the demands on the enslaved workers intensifying. Marcus moved through it all with the same steady, mechanical precision he had shown since Christmas. His body had adapted to the lack of teeth. He had learned to chew with his back molars, to tilt his head when drinking to avoid the sensitive gaps in his gums. His speech remained slurred, but he spoke so rarely that it barely mattered. He had become a figure of silence and endurance, a man reduced to function. But the Caldwells were unraveling. Mrs. Caldwell had stopped sleeping more than a few hours each night. She would wake in the early morning darkness, her heart racing, her body covered in cold sweat, convinced that she had heard something, a footstep in the hall, a creak on the stairs, a voice whispering her name. But when she lit a candle and searched, she found nothing. The house was empty, silent, ordinary, yet the feeling persisted. She began to dread the nights, began to leave candles burning in her room, their small flames a fragile defense against the darkness that seemed to press in from all sides. Thaddeus had grown more volatile. He shouted at the servants for infractions they had not committed, dismissed Hosea and Rufus from his presence over imagined failures, spent hours locked in his study drinking brandy and muttering to himself. His ledgers lay abandoned on his desk, the numbers blurring together, meaningless. He could not concentrate, could not focus, could not shake the sensation that something in his carefully ordered world had come loose, and he did not know how to fix it. One afternoon in mid-March, he rode out to the fields unannounced. The sun was high and pale, the air warm enough that some of the men had removed their shirts, their skin glistening with sweat as they worked the soil. Thaddeus dismounted and walked among them, his boots sinking into the soft earth, his eyes scanning the rows. He found Marcus near the far edge of the field, turning soil with a heavy hoe. Marcus did not look up when Thaddeus approached. He continued working, his movements steady and rhythmic, the muscles in his back and shoulders flexing beneath his thin shirt. "Stop," Thaddeus said. Marcus stopped. He straightened slowly, the hoe resting against his shoulder, his face impassive. Thaddeus stared at him, searching for something. Defiance, fear, resentment, anything. But Marcus's expression was blank, his dark eyes meeting Thaddeus's gaze without flinching, without emotion. "You got something to say to me?" Thaddeus asked, his voice tight. Marcus shook his head. "No, sir." "Then why do you look at me like that?" "Like what, sir?" "Like—" Thaddeus stopped, his jaw clenching. He did not know how to finish the sentence. "Like you're judging me, like you see through me, like you're waiting for something." "I don't mean nothing by it, sir," Marcus said, his voice flat. "Just working." Thaddeus stood there for a long moment, his hands balled into fists at his sides, his chest tight with an anger he could not articulate. Finally, he turned and walked back to his horse, mounted and rode away without another word. That night he drank until he passed out in his chair, the brandy bottle empty beside him. The fire in the study burned down to embers. Mrs. Caldwell found him there in the morning, his head slumped forward, his breathing ragged and shallow. She shook him awake, her hands trembling, her voice sharp with fear. "Thaddeus, Thaddeus, wake up." He opened his eyes slowly, his vision blurred, his mouth dry and sour. "What? You can't do this," she said, her voice breaking. "You can't. Whatever this is, you have to stop." He stared at her, uncomprehending. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Yes, you do," she said, tears spilling down her cheeks. "You know exactly what I'm talking about. That man, that slave. You can't stop thinking about him." Thaddeus pushed himself upright, his head pounding, his stomach churning. "Don't be ridiculous." "I see it," she said. "I see it in you. I feel it in this house. Ever since Christmas." "Enough!" he snapped, his voice loud and harsh. "Enough! I don't want to hear it." She stepped back, her hands pressed to her mouth, her eyes wide and frightened. He had never spoken to her that way before, never raised his voice, never shown her anything but measured, controlled authority. He stood, swaying slightly, and walked past her without another word, leaving her standing alone in the study, the morning light filtering through the windows, cold and pale. In the fields, Marcus continued to work. He felt nothing. He thought nothing. He simply moved through the hours, his body performing the tasks required of it, his mind empty and still. But in the great house, the Caldwells felt him like a weight pressing down on their chests, a presence that could not be ignored, could not be dismissed, could not be escaped, and the thread that held their world together continued to unravel, slow and inexorable, one fraying strand at a time. April arrived with sudden, violent storms. Rain lashed the fields of Thornhill Plantation, turning the soil to thick, clinging mud that made every step treacherous. Lightning split the sky, and thunder rolled across the land like cannon fire. The work slowed but did not stop. There was too much to be done, too much at stake. The enslaved workers labored in the downpour, their clothes soaked through, their bodies exhausted, their hands numb and blistered. Marcus worked among them, his head down against the rain, his body bent to the task. Water streamed down his face, into his eyes, into the gaps where his teeth had been. He did not wipe it away. He did not pause. He simply continued, one movement after another, as though he were a machine designed for this single purpose. In the great house, the storms felt like an assault. The windows rattled in their frames. The roof leaked in 3 places. Buckets set out to catch the drips, the steady plink, plink, plink of water, a maddening rhythm that echoed through the halls. Mrs. Caldwell sat in the parlor, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on nothing. She had stopped trying to sleep. She had stopped trying to pretend that everything was normal. Thaddeus had locked himself in his study. He had not emerged in 2 days, taking his meals on a tray left outside the door, drinking steadily from the bottles of brandy he kept in a cabinet behind his desk. He sat at his desk, staring at the wall, his mind a tangled mess of thoughts that led nowhere, circled back on themselves, offered no resolution. He kept seeing Marcus. In his mind's eye, the image of that ruined mouth, those dark, steady eyes played on an endless loop. He told himself it meant nothing. He told himself Marcus was just another piece of property, another tool to be used and discarded. But the thought felt hollow, unconvincing even to himself. On the 3rd day of the storms, William returned home from university. He arrived unannounced, his clothes soaked, his face pale and drawn. His mother rose from her chair when he entered the parlor, her hands reaching for him automatically. "William," she said, her voice cracking, "what are you doing here?" "I had to come home," he said, his voice flat. "I couldn't—" He stopped, shaking his head. "I couldn't stay there." "Why? What happened?" He looked at her, and she saw something in his eyes that frightened her, something haunted, something broken. "I keep seeing him," William said quietly. "That man. Marcus. I keep seeing his face, every time I close my eyes, every time I try to sleep. He's there." Mrs. Caldwell's breath caught in her throat. She reached for her son, pulling him into an embrace, but he stood stiff and unresponsive in her arms. "It's all right," she whispered, though she did not believe it. "It's all right." But it was not all right. Nothing was all right. That evening, Thaddeus finally emerged from his study. He looked gaunt, his eyes bloodshot, his hair disheveled. He found William in the parlor, sitting by the fire, staring into the flames. "You're home," Thaddeus said, his voice rough. William nodded but did not look at him. "Good," Thaddeus said, though there was no conviction in the word. He poured himself a glass of brandy from the decanter on the side table, his hands shaking slightly. "Good to have you here." William turned his head then, his gaze meeting his father's. "Why did you make me do it?" Thaddeus froze, the glass halfway to his lips. "What? Why did you make me pull his teeth?" William's voice was quiet, almost detached. "Why did it have to be me?" Thaddeus set the glass down, his jaw tightening. "Because you needed to learn. Because that's what it means to run a place like this. You can't be weak. You can't show mercy. They'll take advantage of it." "He smiled," William said, his voice hollow. "That's all he did. He smiled. He disrespected this family," Thaddeus said, his voice rising. "He disrespected God. There are consequences for that." "Consequences," William repeated, the word tasting bitter in his mouth. "Is that what we call it?" "Yes," Thaddeus said firmly. "That's exactly what we call it." William turned back to the fire. I can't get his face out of my head. The way he looked at me. Not angry, not scared. Just like he'd gone
Empty.
somewhere I couldn't follow. Thaddeus said nothing. He picked up his glass and drained it in one swallow, the brandy burning down his throat. Then he walked out of the room, his footsteps heavy on the wooden floor. Outside, the storm raged on. Lightning flashed, illuminating the fields for brief, brilliant moments, revealing the figures of men still working in the rain, their forms bent and struggling against the wind. And in one of those flashes, Thaddeus could have sworn he saw Marcus standing alone in the middle of the field, his body upright, his face turned toward the house, his eyes reflecting the lightning like twin mirrors. But when the darkness returned, there was nothing there. Just rain and mud and the endless oppressive weight of his own guilt. By late April the storms had passed, leaving the land waterlogged and steaming in the sudden warmth. The fields of Thornhill Plantation were thick with new growth, the cotton plants pushing up through the soil, tender and vulnerable. The work shifted to tending the young crops, pulling weeds, reinforcing irrigation ditches, watching for pests and disease. The days were long and exhausting, the sun climbing high and merciless, the humidity so thick it felt like breathing through wet cloth. Marcus moved through the work with the same unyielding steadiness he had shown for months. His body was thinner now, his face gaunt, his eyes sunken. But he did not falter, he did not slow. He was a figure of pure endurance, a man who had been reduced to the most fundamental act of survival, continuing to exist. The other enslaved people at Thornhill had begun to regard him with something approaching awe, not because he was strong, many of them were strong, not because he was brave. Bravery in their world was a luxury that often led to death, but because he had survived something that should have broken him, and he was still here, still standing, still working. His silence had become a kind of testimony, a wordless declaration that could not be erased. In the great house, the Caldwells were falling apart. Mrs. Caldwell had taken to her bed, claiming illness. The servants brought her meals on trays, which she barely touched. She lay in the darkened room, the curtains drawn, her body curled beneath the quilts, her mind drifting through landscapes of fear and regret. She prayed constantly, her lips moving in silent supplication, her hands clutching a worn Bible. But the prayers brought no comfort. She felt as though God had turned his face away, as though she were calling into a void that offered no response. William had not left the house since his return. He spent his days in his room, emerging only for meals, which he ate in silence, his eyes downcast, his jaw tight. He looked like a man haunted, his face pale and drawn, his hands trembling slightly when he lifted his fork. His mother tried to speak to him, to draw him out, but he offered only monosyllabic responses and retreated back to his room as quickly as possible. Thaddeus had stopped managing the plantation. Hosea and Rufus handled the day-to-day operations, making decisions without consulting him, keeping the work moving forward through sheer momentum. Thaddeus spent his time wandering the house, moving from room to room with no clear purpose, his mind fragmented and unfocused. He drank less now, not because he had regained control, but because the brandy no longer worked. It could not numb what he was feeling. It could not silence the thoughts that circled endlessly through his mind. One evening in late April, as the sun set and the sky turned a deep bruised purple, Thaddeus walked out onto the veranda. The air was warm and still, heavy with the scent of honeysuckle and damp earth. He stood at the railing, looking out at the fields, at the small figures of the workers moving through the rows in the fading light. And he saw Marcus. Marcus was standing alone at the edge of the field, his body silhouetted against the darkening sky. He was not working. He was simply standing, his arms at his sides, his face turned toward the house. Thaddeus felt his breath catch in his chest. He gripped the railing, his knuckles white, his heart pounding. Marcus did not move, did not approach, did not raise his hand or call out. He simply stood there, a dark figure against the twilight, his presence undeniable, inescapable. Thaddeus wanted to look away, wanted to turn and walk back into the house, to close the door, to retreat into some corner where he would not have to see, would not have to feel. But he could not move. He stood frozen, his eyes locked on Marcus, his body trembling with something he could not name. Fear, guilt, rage, shame, all of it tangled together into a knot so tight it felt like choking. They stood that way for a long time, the distance between them vast but somehow negligible, the space collapsing into a single point of unbearable tension. And then Marcus turned and walked away, disappearing into the gathering darkness, leaving Thaddeus alone on the veranda, his body shaking, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. Inside the house, Mrs. Caldwell heard her husband's footsteps on the stairs, heard the door to his study slam shut, heard the sound of something heavy, a chair perhaps or a bottle, crashing to the floor. She pulled the quilts over her head and closed her eyes, praying for sleep that would not come, praying for relief that did not exist. And in the cabins, Marcus lay on his narrow cot, staring at the ceiling, his body still, his mind empty. He did not think about Thaddeus Caldwell. He did not think about the house or the fields or the months that had passed since Christmas. He simply breathed, in and out, each breath an act of will, each moment another increment of survival. He was still here, and that, in the end, was the most powerful thing he had. May brought the full heat of summer, the sun blazing down on Thornhill Plantation with an intensity that seemed almost vengeful. The cotton plants grew tall and green, their leaves broad and thirsty, demanding constant attention. The enslaved workers moved through the rows from dawn until dusk, their bodies slick with sweat, their hands raw from the endless cycle of hoeing, watering, picking off insects. The heat was oppressive, a physical presence that pressed down on everything, making each breath feel like an effort. Marcus worked among them, his body lean and hardened, his movements economical and precise. The gaps in his mouth had become a permanent part of his face, altering the shape of his jaw, changing the way his lips rested. When he drank water, he tilted his head carefully, letting the liquid flow around the sensitive tissue. When he ate his meager rations, he chewed slowly with his back teeth, each meal a laborious process, but he did not complain. He did not ask for special consideration. He simply adapted, as he had adapted to everything else. The other enslaved people at Thornhill had stopped trying to understand him. He had become something beyond their comprehension. Not a hero, not a martyr, but a living embodiment of endurance itself. They respected him not for what he said or did, but for the simple, undeniable fact that he continued to exist in the face of what had been done to him. In the great house, the Caldwell family had reached a kind of stasis, a frozen state of dysfunction that felt permanent. Mrs. Caldwell remained largely confined to her room, venturing out only for meals, moving through the house like a ghost, her face pale and drawn, her eyes hollow. She spoke rarely, and when she did, her voice was thin and uncertain, as though she were not sure if anyone would hear her William had announced his intention to return to university, though the term would not resume for several months. He spent his days preparing for the journey, packing and repacking his trunk, writing letters that he never sent, finding endless small tasks to occupy his time. He avoided his father completely, taking his meals in his room, leaving the house only to walk the grounds in the early morning, when he was least likely to encounter anyone. Thaddeus had withdrawn into a kind of internal exile. He no longer attempted to manage the plantation, leaving all decisions to Hosea and Rufus. He rarely left his study, and when he did, he moved through the house like a man walking through a dream, his eyes unfocused, his movements slow and uncertain. He drank less, ate less, spoke less. He was disappearing, not physically but spiritually, his sense of self eroding bit by bit, worn away by the constant gnawing presence of guilt and fear, and something else he could not name. One evening in late May, as the sun set and the cicadas began their nightly chorus, Thaddeus sat alone in his study. The room was dim, the only light coming from a single candle on the desk. The ledgers lay untouched, gathering dust. The brandy bottle sat empty on the floor beside his chair. He thought about Marcus, not in any specific way, not with any clear purpose. The thought simply existed, a constant presence in his mind, like a low hum that never stopped. He thought about that night in the barn, about the sound of the pliers scraping against bone, about the blood and the screams and the way Marcus's body had gone limp, hanging from the ropes. He thought about the months that had followed, about the way Marcus had continued to work, to exist, to endure, about the way his presence had become a weight that pressed down on the entire house, on the entire plantation, on Thaddeus himself. And he realized, with a clarity that was almost painful, that he had not broken Marcus. He had not defeated him. He had not even really hurt him, not in the way that mattered. He had only revealed himself, the cruelty he had inflicted, the violence he had authorized, the pain he had caused. All of it had been a mirror, reflecting back the truth of what he was, what his family was, what his entire world was built upon. And Marcus, by simply surviving, by simply continuing to exist, had held that mirror up for Thaddeus to see. And Thaddeus could not look away. He sat in the darkening study, the candle burning down to a stub, the shadows growing longer and deeper around him. He thought about calling for a servant, about ordering more brandy, about finding some way to numb the overwhelming weight of what he felt. But he knew it would not help. Nothing would help. Because Marcus was still out there, in the fields, in the cabins, breathing and working and existing, and as long as he was there, Thaddeus would never be free of him. The candle guttered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. Thaddeus sat in the blackness, his hands resting on the arms of his chair, his body still, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts that led nowhere. And in the cabin, Marcus lay on his cot, his eyes open, staring at the ceiling. He did not think about Thaddeus Caldwell. He did not think about the house or the fields or the months that had passed. He simply breathed in and out, each breath a small victory, each moment another increment of survival. He was still here, and he would continue to be here, tomorrow and the day after and the day after that, for as long as his body held out, for as long as his will endured, because that was all he had. And it was enough. The story of Marcus did not end with triumph or escape or justice. It ended, as so many stories of enslaved people ended, with survival, with the brutal, unadorned fact of continuing to exist in a world designed to break him. History does not record what happened to Marcus after that summer. The records of Thornhill Plantation are incomplete, the names and fates of the enslaved people there largely lost to time. But the story survives, passed down through generations, a testament to the power of endurance, to the weight of cruelty, and to the undeniable truth that some things once done can never be undone. The masters feared Marcus not because he fought back, but because he survived, and in that survival he became a living reminder of what they had done, a mirror they could never escape, a ghost that haunted them long after the physical scars had healed. Some wounds are visible, some are hidden, but all of them leave marks that time cannot erase.